Professor Honorary Mayor, President of the Singapore Management University, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to thank SMU for very kindly inviting me to speak at the Sim Kee Boon Public Lecture Series. I would also like to thank all of you for coming to this lecture this morning, not only the people who are here, but the students who I understand are listening to this lecture in another lecture theatre through video streaming. Thank you all for taking time from your very busy schedules to come to this lecture. This morning, I'm going to talk about something which is very close to my heart, and that is the futures of higher education. There is, no spelling error here. In deciding on the topic, I decided to use the term futures because there is no single vision for the future of higher education, whether in Singapore or elsewhere. And the reason is simply this: the future is unpredictable. The only constant in today's globalized economy is change. We cannot therefore plan for the future by extrapolating from the past. Instead, we have to have frameworks which make possible a variety of paths depending on how the future evolves. For example, many of you undertaking studies at SMU today will not have only one career. You will have 2, 3, perhaps 4 careers during your working life. I also want to make clear that I'm talking about not only university education but higher education generally. In Singapore, higher education comprises 3 types of institutions. First, the Institute of Technical Education at its colleges. Second, the polytechnics. And third, the universities. This is why I've asked SMU to ensure that polytechnic and ITE students and their faculty are invited to this event. And I hope that the lecture will be of interest to them also. My lecture this morning will be in 3 parts, and you can conveniently think about them as the past, the present, and the futures. The first part looks back at the development of higher education sector in Singapore and the vital role that higher education has played in Singapore's economic and social development. I will then outline some of the current trends in higher education and the challenges that we presently face. And finally, I will look to the futures. I should also preface my speech by saying quite evidently that I'm not the Minister for Education, and therefore it is not my job to determine government policy in this or other sectors. And what my words today are those of a private citizen. But based on my involvement in higher education in Singapore for over 3 decades, I would like to share in the speech later on 3 fundamental principles which I believe should guide the formulation of higher education policies that will benefit Singapore and all Singaporeans. First, the past. Ever since Singapore's independence, higher education has been the cornerstone of our strategy for growth and nation building. As a small country with no natural resources, our only asset is our people. It is therefore imperative that we invest heavily in their development to enable every one of our citizens to realize his or her potential. Our higher education sector started just over 100 years ago with the establishment of a College of Medicine in the British tradition in 1905. And this was followed by Raffles College, which opened in 1929. and both became part of the University of Malaya in 1949, from which the University of Singapore was established in 1962. The tumultuous period leading up to self-government also saw the birth of the first Chinese language university in Southeast Asia, Nanyang University, in 1956. The Singapore and the Ngee Polytechnics were established in 1954 and 1963, respectively, to equip Singaporeans with practice-oriented skills needed for Singapore's growing economy. And so, in the first years of an independent Singapore, our two universities and our two polytechnics prepared young people for new careers in industry, commerce, and other professions. By today's standards, however, access to higher education was limited. Less than 3% of the cohort were admitted to these institutions in 1965. Most young people at the time started work without post-secondary education, with some not even completing secondary school. The government also invested heavily in primary and secondary education during this period. In the 1960s and 1970s, industrialization was Singapore's main economic engine. By the late 1970s, our economy was confronting a new set of challenges, including competition from low-wage countries with a plentiful supply of labor. During the 1980s, Singapore began to shift from labor-intensive activities to more capital-driven and higher value-added industries. We were moving up the value chain and needed to train our people to keep up with these developments. Nanyang University was merged with the University of Singapore in 1980 to form the National University of Singapore. The Nanyang Technological Institute was set up in 1981 with 3 engineering schools, and this later became the Nanyang Technological University, NTU. By the 1990s, the global economy was changing again, with a growing emphasis on innovation and a knowledge-based economy. And to take advantage of this, we created a new institution that was closer to the American style of broad-based education, which we hope would capture and foster the entrepreneurial spirit in Singapore. And this institution was, of course, the Singapore Management University, or SMU. Today, our universities enroll over 50,000 students, with a university cohort participation rate that has grown from 5% in 1980 to 26% in 2010, and this will increase to 30% by 2015. To achieve this rate of increase without lowering standards is a significant achievement by any standards. In parallel, the polytechnic sector grew rapidly from 2 polytechnics prior to independence to 5 polytechnics today. And these 5 polytechnics, Singapore, Ngee, Temasek, Nanyang, and Republic, trained 43% of the cohort in 2010. The Institute of Technical Education, ITE, has similarly come a long way since its rebirth as a post-secondary institution in 1992. ITE is a critical pillar of our education system, providing industry-relevant training to 22% of every cohort. ITE now forms an integral part of the higher education sector in Singapore, ensuring that no young Singaporean leaves our education system without the skills he or she needs to make a living. Now, over the last few weeks, I've been asked more than once whether I favor a Singaporean's first policy in higher education. And simple answer is, I do. What I understand from this is that Singaporeans can be put first. Whatever initiatives we launch, we must always put the interests of Singaporeans and Singapore first. But Singaporeans first is different from saying Singaporeans only. Singapore is an international city, and it would be a grave mistake to close our doors. While putting Singaporeans first, we should not make it too difficult for international talent to come to Singapore. Finding the right balance is not going to be easy, but we must try. I understand that some people believe that the higher education sector should only educate Singaporeans. In addition to the inherent problems of protectionism, however, closing our doors would limit the talented individuals who presently contribute much to Singapore. Closing our doors would also restrict our ability to engage in a kind of collaborative research that has put Singapore universities in the very top ranks of universities in the world. And there is another reason not to close our doors. We live in a region in which Singapore enjoys many advantages. As a small country, however, we have a strong national interest in helping to raise the standards of governance across the entire region. Positioning our institutions of higher education as part of a global network with alumni going on to leadership positions around the world positions Singapore well and secures our relations with other countries and brings further benefits to Singapore. Having said that, we must always remember that our primary responsibility is to Singaporeans. To give Singaporeans and their families every opportunity to be first, to be the best that they can be, and to find their own paths. To that end, Singapore's citizens have priority entrance to primary and secondary schools, and this lays the critical foundation for success in higher education. Many subsidies and scholarships are available to Singaporean students to pursue higher education here or abroad. To ensure that Singaporeans can take advantage of opportunities, the government should continue to monitor carefully the proportion of foreign students in our educational institutions to ensure that the proportion matches the present and future needs of the country, and that Singaporeans are the main beneficiaries of our education policies. In retrospect, what we have achieved, although there is much we have achieved, but what we have achieved in our higher education sector over the past decades may be an easier accomplishment compared with the difficult tasks that lie ahead. Up to now, we always had role models. We could aspire to build our infrastructure and our human resources to first world standards, thereby differentiating Singapore from the other countries in the region. But today, as the International Academic Advisory Panel noted at its meeting last September, Singapore is no longer playing catch-up with Britain, the United States, or anyone else. We have caught up, and today we have to start charting our own path.